Have you ever sat in a luxurious room only to feel like a stranger? Have you ever felt the sting of a scrutinizing gaze or a casual remark that stripped away your right to simply exist as someone worthy of being there? The deepest pain isn't in the words spoken aloud, it's in that silent moment when they treat you as though you were never meant to belong. This was the wound Zara Monroe carried on what should have been an ordinary evening. All she wanted was to capture a memory, a simple photo inside a gilded restaurant. But instantly a cold voice cut her short. "No photos here? Not for people like you." The entire room chuckled. Sparkling lights, crystal glasses, and humiliation wrapped neatly in the disguise of rules. But this is not just a story about disgrace. It is a story about longing, the longing for presence, for recognition, for the right to shine. Because sometimes the very thing they try to hide becomes the brightest torch. And sometimes the silence of one person is enough to expose an entire room before the world. If you've ever believed that justice can be declared without shouting, if you've ever dreamed that our pain could be transformed into power, then you won't want to miss this story. Like this video, share it with those who have endured silent disregard. Subscribe and ring the bell so that every time a story of resilience and justice is told, you'll be the first to hear it. So what truly happened that night? What turned a small, fleeting moment into a storm that swept across the globe? Let us begin. At the very moment Zara Monroe lifted her camera in that room, the chandelier above glittered like a constellation caught in crystal, each shard of light dripping onto polished marble floors. The restaurant was the kind of place designed not for eating, but for being seen, where every bite was performance, and every sip of wine was staged for invisible cameras of status. Zara Monroe knew all of this. She had walked into hundreds of rooms like this before, carrying her presence the way others carried a brand name. Still, she never allowed herself to forget the irony. She, a black CEO at the helm of a global company, could sit at the table and yet always remain suspect, as though her very existence was a kind of intrusion. That evening, Zara wore simplicity as her armor. A charcoal dress, a single gold bracelet, hair pulled back in a low knot. She had come not to impress, but to breathe, to take a quiet meal after a week that had carved deep lines into her spirit. Across from her sat an empty chair. She had chosen to dine alone, a choice that baffled people in a world that equated solitude with failure. She found it freeing. When the first course arrived, Zara leaned back and almost instinctively reached into her bag for her camera. Not the sleek smartphone everyone used for shallow flashes, but a small silver camera she carried everywhere. It was her ritual, to capture one frame that wasn't curated by anyone else, one frame that belonged solely to her memory. She lifted it toward the table, framing the glimmer of candlelight against the curve of her wine glass. And in that simple act, a fissure appeared. The waiter's shadow fell across her lens before she could press the shutter. He was young, crisp in uniform, but his voice carried a sharpness honed not by youth, but by something older, heavier, uglier. "No photos here," he said, his words flat and official, then bent closer, lowering his voice as if delivering a private joke. "Not for people like you." For a heartbeat, the restaurant seemed to inhale. The clinking of silverware slowed. The whisper of conversations thinned. Zara lowered the camera, her fingers still resting on the shutter as if the picture might take itself anyway. She did not answer at once. That was her power. Silence. In silence, she could measure the air, the weight of his words, the ripple of laughter at the table behind her. Because there was laughter. There was always laughter, the kind that said, "Of course this is happening to her." What the waiter did not realize was that silence was not submission. Zara had built entire empires in silence, endured entire boardrooms that mistook her quiet for weakness. Her calm had always been the prelude to storms no one saw coming. So she smiled. Not the gracious smile of a customer, not the awkward smile of someone caught off guard. It was the faint, deliberate smile of a woman who knew the game was rigged and still chose to sit at the table. The young waiter, smug in his invisible victory, stepped back as though he had enforced some sacred rule. Around them, the room's glow returned, chatter rising again, but now with a new undercurrent. Curiosity. Guests glanced at Zara as if watching a scene unfold, as if waiting to see whether she would rise in protest, retreat in shame, or vanish quietly into the night. But Zara Monroe never vanished. She set the camera down, folded her hands neatly on the table, and exhaled. To anyone watching, it looked like acceptance. But to Zara, it was the beginning of something else entirely. And that was when the real story began. What no one in that glittering room realized was that the silence they mistook for defeat would soon turn into the loudest revelation of the night. The luxurious restaurant suddenly fell into a strange void. The clink of a spoon against porcelain froze midair, as if even sound itself had been forced into silence. Zara Monroe remained seated, her hand resting lightly on the camera, her expression so composed that those across from her might have mistaken it for surrender. But her silence was not submission. It was a mirror, reflecting back the rudeness aimed at her. The waiter, with the confidence of someone who believed he held authority, lowered his voice further, just enough for nearby tables to hear. His words cut like a blade, sharp and cold. Not for people like you. 5 words, yet enough to split the entire room into light and shadow. At neighboring tables, a few guests stifled laughter, their chuckles restrained but laced with satisfaction. They did not laugh loudly. Humiliation was not theirs to bear. They laughed because the moment reaffirmed their place on the invisible ladder. Above, while Zara, CEO title or not, remained an outsider. Zara heard every sound, the fleeting smirks, the whispers mingling with wine and smoke. They were no different from the murmurs in a boardroom long ago, when she first claimed her seat of power and every eye waited for her first mistake. The only difference, here there were no agendas, no minutes to record, only made-up rules invented on the spot, weaponized to bind a person in place. She did not move. No protest, no retaliation. Her stillness only emboldened the waiter, amplifying the chuckles around him. Yet beneath the laughter, something went unnoticed. Zara was not being consumed by it. On the contrary, it was they who were being exposed bit by bit, like clowns on a stage unaware that the audience beyond could already see through them. Her eyes drifted slowly across the room. She caught curiosity in one gaze, pity in another, and avoidance in many. Each glance was a small mirror reflecting the truth. The problem was not one smug young waiter, but an entire room so accustomed to prejudice that it had become after-dinner entertainment. Zara set her camera down, fingers interlaced. To onlookers, it was the posture of resignation. But in her mind, a plan had begun to form. If silence could draw out their cruel laughter, then a single act could force the whole room to confront its own reflection. What they didn't know was that their contempt would ignite the very flame that would unravel them. And once it began, no one inside that gilded hall could pretend innocence. She placed the camera down as gently as if it were nothing more than an ornament. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, so thin it could be mistaken for embarrassment. But for anyone discerning enough, it was no smile of defeat. It was the smile of someone who had already seen the whole board and had chosen not to play by another's rules. The waiter, mistaking the smile, thought he had won. He adjusted his tray, stepped back with smug satisfaction. In his mind, Zara was reduced to a troublesome guest, swiftly subdued, a shadow too faint to contend. But Zara knew the truth. The quicker a man savors victory, the easier he is to topple. The laughter still trickled from nearby tables. A platinum-haired woman raised a hand to her mouth, feigning poise while her eyes glittered with disdain. A middle-aged man shook his head, as if dismissing a cheap play. Zara realized the golden lights above gave no warmth. They only revealed the chill between human beings. She did not defend herself. She did not explain. Instead, she straightened her back, folded her hands atop the table, and calmly sipped her water. That serenity made the moment unbearable, because deep down the mockers were waiting for her to break, to argue, to fulfill their prejudices. When she did not, her smile became a mirror exposing their pettiness. In that instant, a thought sparked. No one in this room realized they had become actors in a play, and she was the silent director. Every smirk, every mocking laugh was merely fuel for the ending she would soon script. No one could have guessed that a smile so thin could carry the weight of a storm. But Zara had lived through storms all her life, in boardrooms, in corporate hallways, in first-class cabins. Always there was someone who mistook her smile for weakness, and always they learned it was the beginning of an exposure they could not escape. The restaurant resumed its rhythm, but something had shifted. Not for all, but for the observant. A few guests grew quieter, their laughter subdued. The waiter busied himself more than usual, as if avoiding her gaze. And Zara, calm and steady, kept the faint smile at her lips. Because only she knew. The game had just begun. And once in motion, no one in that gilded hall could fathom what her next move would expose. Zara did not react immediately. She simply set her glass down, dabbed the corner of her mouth with the pristine white napkin, and gave a small nod. Her voice was low and steady, as though she were commenting on an appetizer, not addressing an insult hurled directly at her face. "I'd like to see the manager," she said. The words weren't loud, but they froze the room. The laughter lingering in the air shifted into a collective pause, every eye turning with a hunger not for justice but for spectacle. It was as if someone had flipped on a stage light, and there, at the center of it all, stood Zara Monroe, a black woman daring to break the silence carefully maintained to preserve a fragile illusion of peace. The waiter hesitated, then reluctantly stepped away. His shoes clicked against the marble floor quicker than before, as though eager to escape the confrontation he himself had stirred. Zara remained still, her eyes fixed on the untouched glass of water before her, letting the tension in the air thicken and coil around her like smoke. When the manager arrived, he wore a dark suit, his face trained to project courtesy. But behind his polished manner was the thin pain of arrogance, transparent enough that one could see his thought clearly. Just another troublesome customer. He bowed slightly, not too low, just enough to mimic civility. "I hear you've had an issue," Zara answered with a calmness so cool it bordered on icy. She gestured to the camera resting neatly on the table. "Your staff stopped me from taking a picture. He said it was policy." "I'd like to hear it from you. Is that truly a rule of this restaurant?" The air held its breath. The manager glanced around, catching curious stares, discreet nods, the room itself acting as a silent jury awaiting his verdict. He adjusted his tie, then delivered the kind of smile Zara knew well, the one used to close a conversation, not open it. "Rules are rules," he said smoothly. "We discourage actions that could diminish the brand's image, and frankly, there are certain guests who are not suited to creating images here." The words landed like stones disguised as silk. It was not an explanation, it was a sentence. The room heard it, and once again, laughter flickered, this time quieter, more complicit. They weren't laughing out of joy. They were laughing because the line had been redrawn between belonging and not belonging. Zara's eyes narrowed slightly, as though watching a chess piece move into the wrong square. She knew there was no such rule. What they called policy was nothing but theater, staged to protect an unjust order. And whenever a rule exists solely to push someone out, it can just as easily become the evidence that topples the entire game. What the manager did not foresee was this. When someone is pushed away from the table, they can choose to walk out, or flip the entire table over. His words, rehearsed and monotonous, carried the same hollow cadence she had heard in corporate boardrooms. "We need the right representation. We must preserve a unified image." Harmless phrases on the surface. But in truth, they were just doors slammed in her face, time and again. Each time she remembered the sound of those doors closing, not to break her, but to mark the day she would force them open. The irony could not be sharper. Around her, phones flashed freely. A young couple laughed as they took selfies near the wine display. A businessman snapped a picture of his steak as if it were a prize. A group of women in gowns posed together, their phones clicking like applause. No one stopped them. No one cited rules. Only Zara was silenced, and silenced with condescension. The hypocrisy was naked, yet dressed in courtesy. That was what made Zara laugh silently to herself. Perhaps the manager even believed his words were reasonable. In this world, prejudice rarely shouts. It simply wears the mask of rules. She leaned back in her chair, lips curling slightly as if weighing her next move on a chessboard. The room held its breath. Would she argue? Would she leave? Would she bow her head and comply? Zara had spent a lifetime in spaces where others dictated her options. Tonight, she would not play by their script. The manager had given her something far more valuable than permission. Proof. Proof that the rules were a lie, applied selectively, weaponized against her. And once a lie is exposed, no veneer of civility can patch over the cracks. Her silence did not close the matter, it opened it. It was the toll of a bell, a warning that something was about to be revealed. Zara tilted her head, her gaze sweeping across the room. What she saw made her lip twitch, not in surprise, but in irony. Near the window, a man raised his glass and snapped several photos in quick succession. Behind her, the women in gowns continued their impromptu photo shoot, laughing as camera shutters clicked in chorus. No staff intervened, no mention of rules, only Zara had been singled out. She let the contradiction hang in the air, glowing brighter than the chandeliers above. In her mind, she replayed the manager's words. Some guests lower the image of our brand. Then what of the selfies, the laughing poses, the flashing phones? Did they not lower the image? Or was it only her skin that made her unfit? A smirk flickered across her face. Not the smirk of the defeated, but of someone who had just glimpsed the stage curtains fall, revealing the clumsy mechanics behind the play. Their so-called rules were nothing more than fragile props. Around her, a few guests began to sense the absurdity. A young man frowned, glancing from Zara to the laughing women. An older woman in the corner shook her head, as though she'd seen this charade too many times. But most stayed silent. Silence was safety. And in a gilded room, safety was prized above justice. Zara knew this well. She had lived her life in rooms where truth was hidden beneath policy, but she also knew, once the truth is stripped bare, no policy can mend the fracture it leaves behind. She lifted her glass, swirling the water as if savoring a fine wine. The gesture was simple, yet it unsettled the manager. He had expected anger, an outburst, a raised voice he could eject. But Zara denied him that weapon. Instead, she let the room itself speak its injustice aloud. Because when the contradiction is undeniable, when one group is free to act while another is forbidden, no words are needed. Truth resonates on its own. And in that moment, Zara understood. If she played the move correctly, they themselves would become the evidence of the very discrimination they sought to deny. What they did not yet realize was that her calm smile was not retreat. It was the opening act of an exposure the entire restaurant would be forced to witness, second by second, with nowhere to look away. The first sound to break the air wasn't the piano in the corner, nor the delicate chime of crystal glasses. It was laughter. Loud, unmasked laughter bursting from the table beside Zara's. A group of white diners, dressed with the easy polish of those who belong in gilded rooms, pulled out their phones. They snapped pictures in quick succession, exaggerating their poses like clowns mocking a stage act. One man puckered his lips, snapped a selfie, and cackled so loudly it fractured the golden air. Their eyes flicked towards Zara as if to say, "See, no one stops us." They knew the manager had already silenced her. They knew she was the only one forbidden. And now they seized that knowledge like a prop, turning her humiliation into their private theater. No words were needed. Their laughter itself was the jeer. "We are allowed. You are not." Zara didn't flinch. She turned her gaze toward them, steady, unyielding. Suddenly, their raucous energy became backdrop noise, while her quiet presence cut through the room like a blade. What they hadn't anticipated was this. The more they tried to amplify their dominance, the more they began to look like children giggling in the back of a classroom. Loud, desperate, hollow. A blonde woman caught Zara's eyes. Instead of dropping her voice, she threw her head back and laughed louder, tugging the rest of the table into another round of performance. Yet in that laughter, the strain was audible, because when a single woman, silent and still, forces an entire table to laugh harder just to prove their superiority, it's clear who truly holds the gravity of the room. Zara didn't need to speak. She had heard that laughter before, in corporate hallways where her presence in a black body among pale suits sparked whispered smirks. In gala receptions where the question always landed, "Which department do you work in?" Never believing she was the one in charge. Tonight, that same laughter rang again, but instead of cutting into her, it sliced back toward the mouths that released it. She lifted her glass, sipped water with the calm precision of ritual, not to soothe her throat, but to mark her composure, to say without words, "You cannot move me." Every round of laughter only exposed them further. What they thought was triumph sounded more and more like empty drums rattling in a hollow chamber. And when the noise finally fell, the echo left behind would be nothing but their own absurdity. They laughed to diminish her, but each outburst raised her stature instead, making them look smaller, shrill, childish in contrast. The laughter spread like a low fire, not overwhelming enough to drown the room, but scorching enough that everyone knew its target. Zara sat at the center, and in the cruelest of ways, their voices turned her into an outsider inside the very space she had paid to be in. No insults needed to be spoken aloud. The laughter itself was the verdict. It told the room, she doesn't belong here. And the cruelest part was the tacit approval. No one stepped in, no one signaled for quiet. The rest continued their conversations with feigned indifference, but their eyes drifted toward Zara, spectators watching a play they hadn't paid for. Zara drew a deep breath. This air, thick with prejudice disguised as amusement, was too familiar. She had breathed it in global conferences, where a half-joke could reduce her presence to nothing. She had inhaled it at cocktail parties, where laughter roared at the question, "So whose assistant are you?" And now, in this gilded restaurant, the same air returned, trying once again to push her to the margins. But this time the repetition struck her differently. It didn't sting as sharply as it once did. Instead, she smirked. Because she recognized what their laughter really was, not power, not victory, but fear. Fear that someone like Zara could sit at the same table they once believed belonged only to them. The room grew heavier. Their laughter no longer rang with ease. It clattered like metal on metal. Tinny, brittle, false. Some diners shifted uneasily, realizing the spectacle had crossed into cruelty. Yet they chose silence, protecting their own comfort rather than justice. Zara stayed composed. She smoothed the tablecloth with one hand, an act so small yet laced with authority. The gesture stalled a few chuckles mid-air, as though the sound had choked before leaving the throat. She didn't need to answer. Every burst of laughter had already transformed into evidence, living, breathing proof of the discrimination they worked so hard to deny. What no one expected was this. Zara's silence, firm and unmoved amid their jeers, wasn't weakness. It was the spark that would force the entire room to confront the truth they had been trying to laugh away. The laughter turned harsher, like dull knives stabbing the table, loud enough to unsettle but too blunt to wound. Their frenzy grew, their mockery more animated, as if humiliating Zara had become a shared sport. One man even aimed his phone at her, pretending to snap a photo, laughing so hard his shoulders shook. But Zara raised her head, eyes clear, unblinking. Her gaze held no rage, no plea, only stillness. And that was enough to cut through the noise. A few laughs caught in throats, smothered by the sudden weight of her composure. For while they scrambled to prove their dominance through chaos, she revealed power by doing nothing at all. Her silence was a language, one those addicted to noise could never understand. They mistook laughter for proof of victory, but under her gaze their victory crumbled into childish theater. The room, wordless, began to sense the imbalance. One side shrieking to mask emptiness, the other sitting still to expose it. Memories flickered through Zara's mind. Conference rooms where she had stared down jokes meant to diminish her. Boardrooms where silence was sharper than rebuttal. Always the quiet left a longer scar than any argument. Tonight, in a golden dining hall, that lesson repeated. Some guests shifted, uneasy. Not because the laughter was too loud, but because Zara refused to play the victim. She did not shrink in shame, nor erupt in fury. She sat, her eyes like mirrors, forcing them to see their own hollowness reflected back. A woman at the mocking table adjusted her dress, suddenly avoiding Zara's gaze. A man turned his head, still grinning but thinner now, frayed at the edges. The laughter splintered, losing its full-bodied force. And in the thinning noise, Zara realized the truth. Their laughter had never been proof of power. It was only a flimsy curtain, hiding fear. The fear that her presence, serene and unshaken, would shatter their illusion of ownership over the room. So she sat, eyes fixed, letting them wrestle with their own discomfort. Within their sharp cackles, Zara heard something deeper. Not confidence, but emptiness. Not victory, but unease. And that was the first moment the room began to shift. What was meant as mockery turned inside out, exposing not Zara, but the ones who had laughed. Amid the scattered laughter losing its breath, a gentle touch pulled Zara back into the present. The colleague beside her, another woman of color, lightly tugged at Zara's sleeve and whispered with a trembling voice. "Maybe you should just let it go. Don't make a scene." The words didn't travel beyond the table, yet to Zara they echoed louder than any laughter in the room. Because the jeers of the diners were only crude mockery, but this whisper came from right beside her, from someone who should have understood more than anyone what it feels like to be pushed to the margins. Zara turned her head. Her colleague's eyes shimmered with tension. She couldn't look Zara in the face, staring instead at the tablecloth, fingers gripping its edge tightly. It wasn't betrayal born of malice. It was betrayal born of fear. Fear of being noticed, fear of losing the fragile seat she had fought so hard to keep. And though Zara understood, she still felt the crack splinter across the very table they shared. The room hung silent, waiting for Zara's reaction. Only those closest had heard the whisper, but its weight was enough to pierce the air. For one suspended moment, the silence of the room and the silence of her colleague fused together, forming a cold wall around her. Zara suddenly felt alone, even though another woman of her own skin, her own history of suppression, sat right there beside her. Memory pulled her backward, to the early days of her career when she too had been told the same thing. Don't stand out, don't make waves, stay quiet if you want to be accepted. Always spoken with concern, always disguised as advice, but in truth those words were a leash tying her down, forcing her to shrink into someone else's mold. And it was only because she rejected that leash that she now sat at this table as a CEO. Yet here, at this table, the melody returned. The same warning, now sung in a trembling voice beside her. A part of Zara wanted to place her hand on that woman's shoulder and say aloud, "Silence has never saved anyone." But another part knew the truth. Not everyone is willing to pay the price it takes to break silence. Zara drew in a deep breath, her eyes slowly shifting away from her colleague and back to the room. If betrayal from the outside had fueled her anger, betrayal from beside her carved out a colder wound. It was like wandering through the desert, throat burning for water only to find the oasis was a mirage. The truth stood clear. In this fight, she was utterly alone. And yet, that aloneness didn't weaken her. It sharpened her gaze, made it brighter, unyielding. Because Zara understood. If even the one at her side refused to stand with her, then it was time to turn this table into her own. A chessboard where every move would be hers to dictate. Maybe you should just let it go. Don't make a scene. The phrase floated like a breath but landed heavy as a stone. Zara sat motionless, her eyes narrowing slightly. This wasn't the mockery of strangers, it was the whisper of someone she thought would at least understand what it meant to be labeled the one who doesn't belong. She rotated her wrist, fingers tapping slowly against the table, each beat steady like a drum inside her head. She didn't rush to respond, because what she'd heard wasn't just betrayal, it was the reflection of something deeper. Fear. Her colleague didn't truly want Zara silent. She only wanted herself safe, unseen, untouched, allowed to keep her seat without risk. In that sidelong glance, Zara saw the long history of compromises so many people of color had been forced to make in rooms like this. Nod when needed, smile when required, and, most of all, stay silent when silence was demanded. Such compromises never killed in an instant, but they eroded dignity day by day until a person no longer recognized themselves, living as a shadow. Zara knew that feeling. Years ago, she too had been told, "Don't be too different. Don't draw attention. Play it safe." But had she obeyed then, she would not be here now as a CEO. She would still be standing quietly at the edge, invisible, forgotten. She turned her head slightly, meeting her colleague's gaze. No anger, no blame. Just a long look that sent its own message. I understand your fear, but I refuse to live by it. The woman dropped her eyes, withdrawing her hand from the tablecloth like a child caught in a lie. In that instant, Zara realized her solitude wasn't a curse, it was a choice. For when others chose silence to protect themselves, she was the one willing to break it. And she had long prepared to pay that price. The air at the table grew heavier. Laughter still rang from across the room, but to Zara, it no longer sounded like ridicule. It was the croaking of frogs in a distant field, loud yet meaningless. What she felt most sharply was the gulf opening beside her, a distance that no shared skin or common scars could ever bridge. Zara clenched her hand on her lap, eyes fixed forward. If once she had hoped for someone to stand with her, that hope was gone now. Because sometimes, to change the entire room, you must accept walking alone. And that was exactly what she was about to do. Flip the board, even if no one at her side dared to move with her. She sat unmoving, her body like stone, only her thoughts alive and racing. The whisper no longer rang in her ears, it carved itself deep into her mind. Gentle on the surface, but a velvet-coated blade. Because beneath it lay not concern for her, but fear for the one who spoke it. Her breath came slow, deliberate. To the outside, she might look like she was holding back anger. But inside, it was another storm altogether. Clarity. Zara was no longer the young girl trying to contort herself to fit someone else's mold. She had endured the sneers, the dismissive laughter, the invisible chains. And from that she had learned to spot betrayal dressed as advice. Her colleague ducked her head, as though hiding from Zara's eyes. Believing she had chosen safety, believing she had secured her seat in a room that had never truly opened its doors to her. But Zara knew the truth. Safety bought by silence was nothing but a locked cage. A lifetime spent in a cramped room built by others. Around them, diners continued their meals, pretending not to hear. But even their feigned ignorance spoke loudly. Silence comes in many forms. There is silence as resistance, like the calm Zara now held. And there is silence as surrender, like the whisper she just heard. One preserves dignity, the other erases it. Zara's eyes swept the room, scanning every face. The man still laughed. The platinum-haired woman still raised her glass. Nothing seemed changed, and yet to Zara the picture was utterly transformed. She no longer searched for support. She no longer waited for an ally. A sentence burned in her mind, clear and unshakable. Not all silence is an ally, some silence is a chain. It struck like a hammer, shattering her last fragile hope. Zara understood. If she stayed here in silence like the rest, she would become part of the chain herself. And that was the one thing she would never allow. Her lips curved, not in mockery but in resolve. While her colleague hid behind the false safety of her seat, Zara chose to turn this very table into her battlefield. A battlefield where her silence would not be surrender, but the spark for an exposure no one in this gilded room was prepared to face. Zara sat still, the golden light pouring over her face, casting a soft glow that clashed with the tension gripping the room. Then suddenly the corner of her mouth curved upward. A smile. Not the timid smile meant to smooth over conflict. Not the forced smile of someone swallowing humiliation. It was calm, steady, and utterly detached from the shame others were waiting to see. The room faltered. A few exchanged puzzled glances as if they had just missed a critical cue in the play they thought they were watching. They were used to predictable scripts. The victim bursts into tears, lashes out in anger, or leaves in silence. But no one had prepared for this scene. A black woman, stopped and mocked, sitting quietly, smiling as though she alone already knew how the story would end. The manager squinted. A flicker of unease crossed his eyes because her composure didn't match the sentence he thought he had delivered. To him, silence meant submission. Bowed heads meant defeat. But this smile was no surrender, it was defiance. And defiance in silence unsettles the powerful more than any loud protest. At the next table, the group of diners still laughed, but their laughter thinned, losing rhythm. Zara's smile threw them off balance, like actors mid-performance realizing the audience was no longer watching them at all. Some exchanged awkward glances, their laughter breaking apart. Zara leaned back slightly, her hand brushing the rim of her water glass. The smile lingered, quiet yet firm. To her, it was confirmation. No one else would write this story for her. If they were expecting the familiar ending, she would weaponize that expectation and flip the board entirely. Inside, a strange calm spread through her. She realized she didn't need to shout, didn't need to fight immediately. Some battles are won by the silence that lasts longer than any defense, and some smiles, instead of hiding weakness, mark the beginning of a plan. No one in that room knew that behind that smile, Zara was already setting her next move. A move that would not only reclaim her dignity, but also expose the entire room's hypocrisy to itself. What they mistook for defeat was merely the cover for an impending reversal. And when it began, today's unease would quickly unravel into a shock none of them were ready for. With all eyes fixed on her, bracing for an explosion, Zara simply reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. A small, ordinary gesture, yet in this taut room, it instantly became the center of attention. The manager frowned. Several guests craned their necks as though about to witness a woman quietly type out her apology. But Zara didn't type an apology. Her fingers moved with speed and precision, striking each letter like someone who had been waiting for this moment all along. Her eyes never lifted from the screen, but the curve of her lips deepened, creating a contradiction. From afar, she looked bowed, but up close, she radiated control. The crowd murmured. Some thought she was pleading for help, texting friends or a lawyer. Others whispered that she was secretly taking pictures to unleash online, ready to turn this golden restaurant into a public spectacle. Curiosity swelled, like an audience watching a play but unable to guess the next act. The manager stepped forward, his voice clipped. "Miss, I made the rules clear." But Zara didn't look up. She let his words dangle in the air unanswered, leaving him stranded in the silence. He had expected outrage or begging, something he could crush with authority. But when his command fell into emptiness, he was the one left hanging, exposed in his own house. Zara's fingers paused. She pressed send. One clean movement, sharp as the click of a lock sliding shut. Then she raised her head. Her eyes, serene and unyielding, met the room. A few people instinctively turned away. None of them knew what message she had just unleashed, but her calm posture was enough to seed unease in their minds. In that moment, Zara felt the true weight of silence. People mistake silence for surrender, but in the right hands, silence is simply the sheath for a sharpened blade. And in this room, she had just hidden her blade in a single tap of her finger. The laughter died completely, replaced by anticipation. They didn't know what they were waiting for, but they sensed the room no longer belonged to them. Zara set her phone down, lifted her glass, and took a sip of water as if nothing had happened. Yet within that silence, something had already begun. Quiet, irreversible. The diners in that gold-plated hall had no idea they had stepped onto Zara's chessboard. What they thought was victory was only the opening move of her response, now ticking closer with every second. The clink of silverware and murmured chatter filled the air, but at Zara's table the atmosphere was heavy, as though the ceiling itself had dropped lower. Every eye latched onto her phone, onto her smile that hovered like an invisible challenge. No one knew what she had sent, and it was that not knowing that gnawed at them. The manager stood stiff, his polished expression cracking at the edges. He wasn't used to losing control. He wasn't used to a customer refusing to play along. But with Zara, silence was not submission. It was the echo chamber that made his own authority sound hollow. A nearby guest leaned toward another and whispered, "What is she doing?" The question rippled, growing louder than the soft piano music drifting through the room. Conversations turned, attention shifted, and suddenly no one cared for their wine or their steak. Every eye was fixed on the black woman who sat alone, smiling after pressing send. Zara knew exactly what she was doing. Power isn't always about volume. It's about rhythm. And now, the rhythm of the room was hers. She tilted her glass, the light scattering across her face, her smile unreadable. To those who had mocked her, it was a mirror turned back on them. They had expected rage, and instead, her composure became the very thing that unsettled them most. She remembered every boardroom where she'd been told, "Stay quiet for the sake of harmony." Tonight she was quiet, but not their kind of quiet. This was the quiet of someone who held the blade, waiting only for the right moment to flip the entire table. Her colleague shifted uneasily beside her, the same one who had urged her not to make trouble. The woman sneaked a glance, quickly looking away, eyes betraying a strange mix of fear, curiosity, and reluctant admiration. The anticipation stretched like the charged air before a storm. But Zara knew the storm had already started. It didn't begin with thunder. It began with a single touch on her phone screen. The final words had already flown into the air. Zara took another sip of water, letting the room's curiosity build. She didn't need to shout. All she needed was to press send. The soft music still floated through the restaurant, but suddenly, a different light cut through. From the golden-lit walls, the sleek digital screens that once displayed luxury wines and glittering dishes began to flicker. For a few seconds, the entire room froze in confusion. Then the images changed all at once. No more crystal glasses sparkling under chandeliers. No more artfully sliced wagyu on marble plates. Instead, a face appeared. Not a movie star, not a celebrity politician, but the face of a janitor. Skin browned by long hours, eyes weary yet proud, a faint smile blurred beneath the mask tugged down at his chin. Some guests leaned forward, thinking it was a glitch. But when the second, then the third, then every screen in the room lit up with different faces, the busboys, the kitchen hands, the dishwashers, the ones who usually slipped like shadows through the back doors, no one thought it was a mistake anymore. This was no accident. This was a message. Zara sat still, her glass of water untouched. She scanned the room, listening to the whispers ripple through polished tables. Some frowned in irritation. Others forced indifference, though their eyes betrayed unease. Because none of them had ever thought about those familiar yet invisible faces, now filling every screen in a room designed to glorify wealth. There was a strange power in it. Faces lined with fatigue became the centerpieces. Hands once dismissed as background props now came alive in detail. Wrinkles, sweat, quiet endurance. The screens stopped advertising luxury. Instead, they became mirrors, forcing every guest to confront the truth they had long ignored. The manager's face drained of color. He rushed toward the control booth, signaling frantically at the technicians. But Zara's earlier moves had already rewritten the system. Every attempt to shut it down triggered new images. Faces sharper, steadier, more unshakable. The table of guests who had mocked Zara sat frozen. A young man lowered his phone, staring at the screen nearest him where a black waiter's face appeared, framed by the glow. The blonde woman who had sneered earlier bit her lip, her laughter buried under silence. Zara said nothing. She let the room face what it had chosen not to see. The invisible had been dragged into the spotlight, and no chandelier could dim it. And this was only the beginning. Once the unseen became the center, no one in that gilded hall could pretend blindness again. The images shifted on. No more glossy posters. No more sparkling champagne glasses. Now the walls carried real faces. Soap still clinging to a cleaner's gloves. Sweat beading on a sous chef's forehead beside a roaring stove. Bruises on a young busboy's arm from trays too heavy. Every one of them people of color. The air thickened. The glow of crystal and golden lights no longer commanded power. Instead, they framed the workers' faces, bearing the weight of histories hidden behind kitchen doors. Some guests turned away sharply as if avoiding the gaze would make the truth disappear. Others stared, restless, too uneasy to speak. They were used to dining without thought of the hands that fed them, but now they could not look away. The truth towered above them, magnified, undeniable. The manager barked orders, but every command collapsed. For each image erased, another appeared. An older woman, streaks of silver in her hair, red-eyed from overnight shifts. A boy barely 20, calloused hands clutching a tray, his grin unbroken. No accusation, no complaint, just presence. And presence was enough to tilt the room off its axis. The guests who had ridiculed Zara earlier dropped their laughter. Phones stilled. Smirks died. Heads bowed, eyes darted away, each afraid the images might see too far inside. The banquet's glitter cracked, leaving raw truth exposed, their power balanced on the backs of those they never bothered to see. Zara remained quiet, her lips curled in the faintest line. Her glass tilted, light refracting through it, slicing the room in a silver beam. She raised it, sipping slowly, like she had orchestrated this moment from the very start. No rush, no flourish, just quiet inevitability. The screens had once been meant to elevate the brand. Now they betrayed it, turning into mirrors reflecting the invisible truth. Whispers rose like wind. Who are they? A guest muttered. Another answered, voice low with discomfort. The staff. I saw that boy this morning. The words spread, slicing through the silence like knives. Zara knew the plan had struck the nerve. Once the truth stood magnified, no one could claim injustice didn't exist. And the more they tried to avert their eyes, the deeper the images cut. Because some faces once seen could never be forgotten. A fork clattered against porcelain, loud as a bell in the hush. All eyes stayed locked on the screens, on faces that had never before been given a stage. No ads, no glamour. Just eyes, honest and unflinching, staring back as if to ask, "Do you really see us now?" A middle-aged man cleared his throat, tugging at his tie, his hands trembling despite his stiff posture. His wife whispered, "Can't they turn it off?" Her voice, small yet sharp, carried across the silence, slicing deeper into the collective unease. The screens refused to yield. It was as if the room itself had chosen to speak for the silenced. One face after another lit up. An older woman with weary eyes, a boy not yet grown, workers whose names no one in that hall had ever asked. Each breath etched itself across the walls. The guests lowered their heads, their arrogance stripped away. The power they flaunted dissolved under the gaze of those they had dismissed. And Zara? She simply sat, her silence louder than any speech, her presence turning the room into a stage she alone directed. From the start, she had known. She had known the light would shift, and when it did, it would no longer shine on those who claimed authority, but on those they had buried in the shadows. She lifted her glass again, her calm unbroken, her eyes steady on the screens. Because from the very beginning, Zara had always known the final light would stand with her. As the screens kept projecting those silent yet weighty faces, an unexpected sound cut through the heavy air. It wasn't the shuffle of hurried staff. It wasn't the muttering of restless guests. It was the scrape of a chair across polished wood, sharp, deliberate, unmistakable. A group of VIP guests rose from their seats. Perfectly tailored suits, flowing designer gowns. The kind of presence that carried weight beyond wealth. They weren't just diners, they were the kind of partners the restaurant's management would bend backward to please. They were the revenue stream that kept the lights burning. And now they stepped away from the most prestigious table in the room, heading straight toward Zara. The crowd stirred. The manager froze for a beat, trying to predict their move. He prayed they would walk out. That would be the perfect excuse, a reason to accuse Zara of hurting the brand. But what happened next shattered every expectation. The man leading the group advanced calmly, his gaze fixed squarely on Zara. When he reached her table, he extended his hand. The entire room held its breath. Then, applause. One clear, steady clap echoed, firm and deliberate. Seconds later, the rest of the group joined, their palms striking together in rhythm, their eyes lit, their smiles carrying something unmistakable: recognition. In that instant, the room flipped. Applause thundered where mockery had once echoed. It wasn't polite, it wasn't performative. It was a declaration. They saw Zara, and they stood with her. Other guests faltered. Some dropped their gaze to their plates, pretending to eat as if their utensils could shield them. Others shifted awkwardly, trying to act as though they had always agreed, though their laughter minutes before still lingered in the air. The speed of their shift revealed the fragility of so-called collective power, strength that only holds when silence prevails, but collapses the moment someone dares to clap first. Zara remained seated. She did not rise, nor did she take the hand immediately. Instead, she let the applause spread, let it hammer against the false walls of civility until the sound itself became a wrecking ball. Her faint smile carried no surprise, only certainty. The quiet satisfaction of someone who had already seen this moment long before it arrived. The manager's eyes betrayed panic. His calculation had been simple. Public humiliation would isolate Zara, and the room would turn against her. But now, the very patrons he feared losing most were applauding the woman he had tried to erase. What the restaurant had deemed a loss of face was becoming its moment of exposure. And under the shimmering chandeliers, one truth became undeniable. Power has never belonged to the one giving orders. It has always belonged to those who dare to break silence. And this was only the prelude. As the VIPs stepped forward, every eye tracked them. The manager braced himself, hoping they would leave. That would have been clean. That would have been convenient. But instead they stopped at Zara's table. The man in front, his face once gracing the cover of business magazines, offered his hand again, gripping hers firmly, his voice loud enough for the entire room. Remarkable. Thank you for reminding us of what truly matters. The words landed like a slap across every laugh that had filled the air moments ago. Silence crashed down. The manager paled, sweat dampening his forehead. A waiter fumbled, dropping a cloth to the floor. The script they had imagined, a dramatic exit in disgust, had turned into an unforeseen act of honor. One by one, the other VIPs shook Zara's hand. A silver-haired woman leaned close, her tone quiet but piercing. We've grown too comfortable pretending not to see. Thank you for forcing us to look. She straightened, clapping firmly, decisively, the sound ricocheting like a verdict. The rest of her group followed, their applause cascading in waves. The rhythm cracked through the gold-plated space, dismantling the room's usual cadence. It wasn't the cheer of a concert, it was acknowledgement. It was surrender from a wall that had stood too long, unchallenged. Other tables faltered. Some guests clapped half-heartedly, terrified of being the only ones left in silence. Others stayed still, lips pressed tight, hands stiff on their laps. They were the ones who had laughed loudest minutes ago. Now every clap from others became a spotlight on their shame. The manager muttered orders, his voice trembling. "Turn it off. Turn this off now." But even he knew it was useless. Nothing could be restored. The restaurant had unmasked itself in front of the very clients it treasured most. Zara, meanwhile, shook hands without hurry, without spectacle. Her composure did not waver. She remained the still center while the room reshaped itself around her. Under the glow of the screens, she embodied the reversal. The woman deemed out of place was now the axis of recognition, while her detractors shrank into shadows. The applause rolled on, then ebbed. When it faded, silence reclaimed the room. But this silence was not the same as before. At first, silence had been complicity, a weapon turned against her. Now, silence was confession, heavy, unspoken, a truth pressing down on those who had laughed loudest and now bowed deepest. The young man who had mocked her tried to lift his wine glass, but his trembling hand spilled the liquid across the linen. The blonde woman who had smirked so proudly stared hard at her plate, as though it had suddenly become the most important object in the world. The reversal was complete. Zara had never needed to speak. The room itself had delivered her justice, transformed from laughter to applause, from ridicule to shame. And in that gilded chamber, silence finally spoke louder than words. That very night, just hours after Zara set her glass down, clips from inside the restaurant began spreading across every social media platform. No one knew exactly who uploaded them first. Perhaps it was a quiet guest who captured the moment the screens changed. Perhaps it was an employee determined to keep evidence. But in the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that millions of eyes now saw the truth that the gilded room had tried to bury. On viewers' phones, it wasn't glossy images of golden plates that went viral. It was the faces of the black and brown staff. People shared them as though they were works of art. A janitor with silver hair became a symbol of resilience. A kitchen hand with sunken eyes transformed into the face of silent pride. Each face, once invisible in the shadows of the kitchen, was now lifted up like stars. By the next day, the restaurant was eerily empty. Tables once booked months in advance sat covered with white cloths, untouched. The giant screens restored to their old luxury images now became a joke. Everyone knew what they had revealed just days earlier. Headlines piled on, op-eds and columns calling it the downfall of arrogance. Meanwhile, the restaurant's staff of color were interviewed, praised, and invited to share their stories. The older woman who quietly cleaned the corners of the dining hall was now speaking live on local television. The young busboy received thousands of thank you messages from strangers he'd never met. For the first time, they were being recognized not for the silent labor they performed, but for their undeniable presence. Zara watched it all from a distance, the glow of her office computer reflecting off her face. A soft smile touched her lips, but her eyes didn't shine with pure joy. She knew the power of a viral video, how it could flip public opinion overnight, how it could turn silence into thunder. But she also knew the bitter truth. Public opinion changes as quickly as the wind. Today, the world celebrates justice. Tomorrow, a new scandal will push it aside and eyes will look away. She sipped her coffee, leaned back and wondered, would that clip really change anything? Or was it just a wave crashing onto the shore, loud for a moment, then gone, leaving the sand untouched? The restaurant would suffer, perhaps lose money, perhaps lose customers for a time. But the eyes of disdain she had seen the night before, would they really disappear? Or would they simply return in a sharper disguise? That question, not the viral clip, was what kept Zara awake. Tilting her laptop, the blue light washed across her face in the dark. Millions of views, hundreds of thousands of comments, countless shares. People were calling her a symbol, comparing her to pioneers who had once dared to challenge the rigged rules of the game. Yet deep inside, Zara felt no relief. She knew a viral video is not the answer. She had seen this cycle too many times. Again and again, an incident explodes. The community roars. Hashtags flood every feed. And then, weeks later, the noise fades. The story sinks into the ocean of new headlines. The once praised faces fade back into invisibility. And worst of all, prejudice doesn't die. It shifts form. It slides underground, like a current that never stops. Zara pressed her hand to her chest, listening to her heartbeat, as if to ask whether hope could really stand against the persistence of bias. She knew the insults hurled at her in that restaurant were not aimed at her alone. They were the tip of an iceberg, a deep, entrenched structure. For years, countless others had been dismissed under the guise of rules, standards, brand image. Time after time, those words became weapons to push them out. On social media, many wrote, "We won." Zara read it and smiled faintly. Won? Was a clip shared millions of times really a victory? Or was it just a gust of wind, giving people the illusion of justice while the world carried on as before? She remembered the look of her black colleague who had whispered, "Don't make it bigger." That look wasn't betrayal. It was fear. Fear of being sidelined. Fear of losing opportunities. Fear of retaliation. And that truth was something no viral video could erase. Silence born from survival. Zara closed her laptop. In the dark, she saw one thing clearly. If change was to come, it had to go further. Beyond a viral moment. Beyond the temporary humiliation of an arrogant restaurant. She needed an act that would strip prejudice of its hiding places, drag it into the light where it couldn't retreat. Viral was only the beginning. What she needed was a plan to turn that moment into a lasting conversation, into a shift that couldn't be undone. Late at night, Zara poured herself another cup of bitter black coffee. She wasn't looking for sweetness. She was looking for the sharp sting, the reminder that the real fight was just beginning. And in that moment, with the night wrapped around her office window, she knew it wouldn't be the applause or the viral clips, but the next move that would define her worth. The next morning, the restaurant held a closed-door meeting. The manager, the waitstaff, the very faces that had mocked Zara the night before, all sat huddled like an army after defeat. On the table, their phones buzzed nonstop with messages, emails, urgent directives from higher-ups, PR crisis, issue apology immediately, control the narrative. Red alerts scrolled across their screens like knives slashing through the arrogance they once flaunted. But strangely, the very people who had laughed so loudly now sat in silence. No one dared to speak. No one dared to laugh. The silence was heavy, suffocating, so different from the jeering chorus of the night before. Because this time, there was no escape. The phones, the cameras, the videos had proven that their so-called rules never existed. The clip had turned their lie into a global punchline. In the corner, the waiter who had sneered, "Not for people like you," sat hunched, hands clenched tight, as if wishing to disappear. No apology left his lips. Sometimes shame weighs too heavy for words. The manager who had declared, "Some guests lower the image of our brand," now sat pale, eyes darting away. He realized too late that the only thing lowering the image wasn't Zara's presence. It was his own arrogance, exposed to the world. And Zara, she wasn't there. She didn't need to be. In this age, sometimes the strongest presence comes from absence. She knew those same people were now drowning in the silence they had once imposed on her. A silence bitter, not protective. The silence of the unmasked. And that silence, paradoxically, thundered louder than any scream. It echoed in the morning headlines, branding them symbols of discrimination hidden behind fake rules. It echoed in the mocking comments, where readers no longer believed in the glittering facade of a once proud brand. It echoed in the cancellations pouring in from major partners. Zara understood. True victory doesn't come from the viral clip. It comes from the moment when the powerful are forced to sit in their own silence. A silence no longer a weapon, but a verdict. And as Zara closed her notebook, the morning light streaming through her office window, she knew one thing. This time, silence had switched sides. Silence had returned, but this time it belonged to the exposed. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.